As we jump into my top 10 tips for your food budget, I want you to keep a few things in mind. First, these tips are focused on your grocery budget, not necessarily your eating out budget or an overall food budget. This is because I believe that budgeting for food needs to be separated between eating out and groceries. I also recognize that your food budget that's allocated just to the grocery store is one of the most challenging, if not the number one most challenging category for Americans in their monthly budget. And this largely comes down to the fact that grocery stores are the absolute experts on getting you to buy things impulsively. So as we gear up to engage with the grocery store, we don't want to be that young adult version of me that was looking in the cereal aisle thinking that I could buy anything. We want to be someone who's coming in with a plan, someone who's coming into the grocery store with a frugal plan. Now, I've listed these tips in the order of what I've perceived to be least important to most important, but they're still all very important. Tip number 1, compare price per unit. It's not enough to just look at the price tag and the dollar sign that's on the price tag. For example, let's say we're going down the produce aisle and you see a bunch of apples. You've got apples on your shopping list. You want to buy apples. Well, they're the loose apples that you can bag yourself, but they're also the pre-bagged apples that are over there on the end. How do you know which one is going to be cheaper? Well, you want to bag about as many apples as there are in that pre-bagged thing over there, but you don't know which one's going to be cheaper necessarily. Well, you have to look at the price per ounce, the price per pound, or the price per count. When it comes down to it, the most frugal option for you in the long run is going to be buying the least expensive item if the health benefits are identical between the two and you're not focused on a food sensitivity. Looking at the price per unit. The grocery store knows that you're more likely to buy the item that looks cheaper if you're just comparing the price tag at face value. So they put the price per unit in really small text below or in and around the final dollar sign. And even though it takes a little bit more effort to compare items on a per unit basis, it can help you maximize the bang for your buck. Tip number 2, 2 for 3 does not mean that you have to buy 2. When a grocery store lists a sale and they're like, well, get 5 for $3, what they're really doing is giving you the unit price with a multiplier on it, so you think you have to buy more than you actually have to. The sale applies no matter how many you buy. If you have 2 avocados for $3, each avocado is $1.50. There's no way around it. You could buy 1 avocado, you could buy 5 avocados. They're going to charge you $1.50 for each if that's the sale. So don't buy more than what you need based on your shopping list. All right, this next one is going to come with a little bit of a cooking tip. Tip number 3, buy the discounts and freeze them. More often than not, a grocery store is going to have the slightly older meat that needs to sell now, and they'll discount it in order to push the product out and through before it goes bad. Well, you can buy that protein at a steep discount, along with other refrigerated items that follow a similar trend. Utilizing these deals can be a little bit tricky because if you buy something that's already been on the shelf for a little while, you might feel like you need to use it right away. Well, you can prep that food and freeze it and extend the shelf life until you don't feel like you have to scramble and rearrange your plans for the next meals in order to accommodate a really good deal. And here's the cooking tip. Amanda and I really like to buy salmon. Now, salmon is expensive, especially if you buy the salmon fresh. So if the salmon is on sale because it's been for sale for too long, well, we'll buy it and we'll season it. We'll cut them up into 2 serving size portions and we'll bag them and freeze them. Later, when we want to make fish and not stink up the house, we'll pull out one of those bags of frozen fish and cook it in the sous vide. The sous vide, or a circulating cooker, is a device that heats up water to the doneness temperature in a pot, and it circulates the water through so you can just drop the bag in, and whatever you're trying to cook will hit the doneness temperature, but not go above it. Overcooking something like fish typically happens when the temperature gets too high, but if you drop it in and you set it to the doneness temperature for salmon, you could just leave it in there. Back when both of us were working and commuting before we had Oliver, we would drop the salmon in the sous vide in the morning, and when we'd come back at the end of the day, it would be perfect. It wouldn't be overcooked at all, and it would be done. And because it was in a sealed bag, the fish didn't stink up the house. It was amazing. And we've been able to manage this with beef, pork, and chicken as well, all while taking advantage of the best discounts that we can find. Tip number 4, the generic item typically comes from the same factory as the branded item. Now, the recipe might be just a little different. There are some generic items at the store that I cannot tell the difference between it and the branded item. And the branded item costs a lot more. Now, that's not always the case, but I want to encourage you to try the generic items at the grocery store if you haven't tried them before. If I told you you saved 30 or 40% on something because it was the generic version and you couldn't tell the difference, well, why wouldn't you do that? Additionally, when a grocery store organizes their shelf, they're going to put the most expensive items or the items that they want to push, the items that they think you're most likely to buy at eye level. That's what you're looking at. The cheaper items or the generic items are probably going to be lower on the shelf near the floor where it's harder for you to see. So if you're looking for the cheapest item, and that includes the cheapest item per unit, be looking lower on the shelf. Don't be looking eye level, don't be looking up, and don't be looking at the end caps. Be looking below. Tip number 5, don't be afraid of substitutions. When you're getting ready to make a recipe, you're really excited for the recipe, it could call for an eccentric ingredient or something that is a lot more expensive than what you would normally otherwise buy. But you still want to make this recipe, you're excited for it. Well, don't be afraid to search the web for substitutions for that particular expensive ingredient. Especially with the expensive ingredients, there are viable substitutions that people have thought about, that people have tried in recipes, and it could be worthwhile trying them in order to save some money. Tip number 6, meal plan every week. This was something that I personally was relatively resistant to. My wife was very good at planning out her meals every week. She'd start the weekend by pulling down a little whiteboard that she had on the fridge and write down everything she wanted for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for each day that week. And she would use that information to inform her on what she needed to buy from the store. For her, the greatest driving factor was, well, if it's written down and it's already decided in advance, well, I don't have to come back from work and go, well, what am I going to make for dinner? And be tossing it around until eventually you're too hungry to decide and be crippled by your indecision and eventually break down and buy something that you otherwise wouldn't have from a restaurant. Now that I've been meal planning with Amanda for a while, I recognize that planning your meal plan, writing down what you want to make for each meal, or at least what you want to eat for each meal, allows you to take a lot more control over how efficiently you use your food and how efficient your shopping trips can be. If you know what you need to make for the upcoming week, you're going to know what you need to buy from the store for the upcoming week. So you can be a little bit more intentional about what you buy, and you don't have to buy a whole bunch of extra things just in case you need them. You give every meal a mission. You give every meal a decision, and that helps you optimize your intentionality while also reducing your waste, while reducing the food that goes bad, helping you be more efficient, helping you be more frugal. Tip number 7, check the sales before you meal plan. Why do you do this? Well, if you go to the store after you've made your meal plan and you're like, I'm going to buy these things, but you see the sale and it's like, well, I can't pass that up. Well, all of a sudden that might change some of the meals that you make, and that's going to change other items on your list. And it's going to be really hard to redo your meal plan while you're standing there in the store. And a lot more decisions are going to be made. You're going to have a lot more decision fatigue in engaging with just the effort of buying that sale. Well, you might pass it up in order to avoid going through that effort, or you might end up seeing your whole meal plan come crashing down because you're trying to be frugal and you're trying to go for the sale. So check the sales ahead of time before you meal plan so you can meal plan around those deals and capture that savings without causing yourself undue stress. Now we're down to the final 3. Tip number 8, make a shopping list. This one might be something you'd expect earlier in the list, but it really makes a big difference to go into the store with a list. Most grocery store purchases, I believe on average, according to the food theorists, 51% to 65% of grocery store purchases are unplanned. No matter how you shake it there, that's the majority of them. And I know early on in the podcast, I talked about, well, how do I know something is intentional? I go to the store, I see something I need, I buy it because I intentionally needed it. But if it wasn't written down, I cannot discern if it is actually an intentional purchase or not. If you go in with a shopping list, you're a lot more likely to stick to it. You don't have to be thinking, well, am I remembering this? Am I forgetting this? And waste time dawdling. It's very important that you get in and out of the store quickly. After about 40 minutes or so of making decisions on your grocery shopping, you're going to start making more emotional decisions and less logical decisions. If you have a list to stick to, you're much less likely to make emotional decisions. You're a lot more likely to be efficient with your shopping, and you're definitely going to be more intentional and more frugal. Tip number 9, track your spending each week as you go through the month. You're probably going to have a finite amount allocated in your monthly budget dedicated to groceries. And the main goal of trying to stick to the budget is staying on point, at least just below the food budget. That's the goal. We want to try to not overspend on groceries. We've given ourselves a limit. Well, how do you know if you're staying under budget if you're not tracking it? I typically like to go to the grocery store once a week. There's typically 4 weeks in a month, so I can take my monthly budget for food, divide by 4, and say each trip is going to be limited to this amount. After I check out, I can see if I was above that or below that. And for the next weeks, I can break down what remains and adjust those numbers. And I repeat this exercise as I go through the month until the last month I know how much I need to stay under in order to make that work. If you're making a meal plan and a shopping list in advance, and you can get a good idea of whether or not that particular meal plan that you wrote is going to be able to stay within the limit of what you're making, you're going to have an idea of what's going to be something that's more expensive to make versus something that's cheaper. If you're going to make crab cakes, well, that's something that's much more expensive than goulash. Ultimately, all these start to tie together here. I personally update my budget as often as money is spent on food so that I can get a holistic idea of where I am with the budget and know with confidence how much I can spend on my next grocery trip. Finally, tip number 10, take a calculator to the store. This is probably the weirdest one, but it kind of falls in line with tracking your budget as you go through the month, but it's tracking what you're putting in your cart as you put things in the cart. It's really hard to try to stay under the amount that you want to spend that week if you have no idea how much is in your cart. And that's the thing. The grocery store doesn't have a way for you to keep track of how much you're spending as you're going through the store as if you were filling up a cart with online shopping. And they know this. So if you take a calculator, and I recommend a scientific calculator like this one. This one is a Texas Instrument, a very simple one. Costs, I think, $15 or so. It's the one I used in school. It's got a failing battery now. But it remembers what you've typed in as you're adding things up for your cart. So if you mistype a number, you can go back and go, oh, well, I typed in multiply instead of add, or I meant subtract that one because I put it back, but I hit divide. Well, you can make sure that you're staying on track. The first few times I tried to follow the idea of keeping track of the value in my cart, I tried to do it on my cell phone, and that calculator didn't have a history function to it. So we'd be going through the store, I'd mistype an operator or bump the screen, and my whole tracking method for the value in my cart would go out the window, making the whole effort futile. So take a real calculator where you can, scroll back up and go, oh yeah, I messed up here, and calculate in advance the tax. You know how much you can spend on your budget. Well, if taxes say 3%, you're going to have to take that number and divide by 1.03 in order to get what you can actually spend. And that gives you your target of the maximum value that you can put in your cart that week. Early on in the month, you have a little bit more leeway. If your shopping list ends up going over $10, you could probably spread that out over the next few weeks and just reduce your spending for the next few trips. Or if you underspend early on, well, you can boost your shopping trip spending later on in the month. But on that last shopping trip of the month, it's critical that you know how much is in your cart on that last shopping trip so you can genuinely stay under budget without having one impulse purchase throw you over. One other thing that I noticed after taking a calculator to the store for the first time is I was way less likely to put something in the cart spontaneously. All of a sudden, the expense of every item that I was grabbing off the shelf and putting in the cart mattered. I became a lot more sensitive just intuitively as to what the most frugal choice was going to be. I started checking price per unit much more intentionally. And if there's a really large or bulk item I was going to buy in order to get a much lower cost per unit, well, I could recognize during the shopping trip whether or not I could afford the extra cost in general, or if I had to go for something that was smaller, even if it was a little bit more expensive on a per unit basis. Taking the calculator to the store was the ultimate game changer for me. It did what cash stuffing does for the nerd in my heart. And it goes beyond the benefits of cash stuffing. I think this is better than cash stuffing in general. Well, cash stuffing doesn't necessarily mean that you're keeping track of the value that you're putting into your cart. It means that you're probably going to be more naturally cognizant, but it doesn't give you a means or a habit of keeping track of what's in the cart. You could easily get to the checkout on your last trip of the month with your cash stuffed envelope overspent. You run out of cash. What do? You got to put something back then. You got to go back in line. Those lanes are narrow. You're going to have a hard time going back. You're going to have to tell someone embarrassingly, I can't afford this month. I'm going to set this aside. No, know in advance before you get in line. Take a calculator to the store. It's going to be a game changer. It'll change your shopping trips forever. Now, after practicing that for a while, you may not need to take a calculator to the store. Every single time you'll get a good idea when you get into a rhythm and a habit. But it's still something that I like to do. If I'm shopping and I'm trying to stay under budget, I take a calculator. Lastly, as a bonus, if you take a calculator with you, you can get to the checkout and tell the person who's checking your groceries, hey, I need you to keep it under, and then you blurt out some oddly specific number and you're really, really close to it. And that's what you need to keep it under. And when it gets close to the end, they're going to be like, wow, how'd you know it was so close? Or you got it right. That was really cool. Or, I didn't think I could make it. It was getting close to the end. And then it happened. You did it. Or you bust out the coupons and the price drops and it's like, oh, that worked. You made it. Anyway, those are my top 10 tips for keeping your food budget, your grocery budget, within budget. Do you agree with my list? Do you have any other tips that you think are equally valuable or more valuable that I didn't think of here? What do you think of taking a calculator to the grocery store? Is that something you're going to do? Let me know in the comments below. If I get enough tips in the comments on this episode, well, I may very well make a follow-up episode to this and conglomerate some of those tips and share them with everybody so that if you're on a platform where that comment didn't pop up, you can hear it. With that, until next week, budget bravely and enjoy your hope-filled financial future.